Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today, with great pleasure, my guest is a longtime friend and a colleague, Professor Awad Alaby. Awad is currently an associate professor at Wright State University, and I can easily say that he's the world-leading expert, probably the only one, that knows everything about the famous Nabi Musa festival. Obviously, we're going to talk extensively about its origins, its developments, and also its end and possible resurrection in the last few years or so. Suffice to say that the Nabi Musa festival certainly marked the life of Jerusalemites for centuries, in fact, not just the Islamic community, but also the Jewish and Christians around the city. Awad has published a number of articles focusing on the festival, but also focusing on the question of rituals and obviously the banners connected to the Nabi Musa festival. And more importantly, he has an upcoming book, Palestinian Rituals of Identity, the Prophet Moses Festival in Jerusalem, 1850-1948, that will be published by University of Texas Press. And I'm really looking forward to read it, hopefully in the next spring when it will be published. But first of all, Awad, welcome.
Thank you very much, Roberto. A pleasure to be here. Long-time listener, first-time guest. I've always wanted to say that.
And I will take advantage later to ask you a few things about your experience of a podcast, since we are reaching the end of season 2. But the first question, which is inescapable, is what is your Jerusalem? What is your connection with the city?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I've always enjoyed listening to your podcast. Well, I was born in Jerusalem just before the '67 war, but my family lived in Ramallah. I grew up with a lot of romantic stories about Jerusalem because my mother was born there and my mother's family is from Jerusalem, and my grandmother, her side of the family, lived in the Christian quarter of Jerusalem. So I grew up with these kind of romantic stories. My grandmother's home church was Maria Up, the church right next to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And my mother, her family eventually lived in Upper Baka. And she was really very much a part of the city in a way that a Palestinian can no longer be a part of the city today. She was a young woman in the 40s, and she remembered, and she would tell us stories of riding her bicycle to the YMCA and going into the old city, and she can remember seeing Edward Said's family bookstore, and she had friends from the who were Muslim and Jewish, and that to her those weren't very political borders. At that time, that this was just part of her larger Arab community, the Arab Jewish and Palestinian community. And so she was really, I look at it today like she was really coming of age just at the time this entire city and conflict and country was collapsing in front of her, in the way that she understood it. And it was a life interrupted, in a way, to borrow a title, Jerusalem Interrupted, edited by Lina Jayusi. And so 1948, of course, the Nakba was the turning point in her life and her family's life. They were one of the few families that remained in Jerusalem. And I think there were maybe no more than about a dozen Palestinian families, and I think a few Armenians who remained in West Jerusalem. And it was very challenging to remain there. Her brother was sent to Jordan to open up the family business. Another brother was studying in Beirut, but her two sisters and her brother remained with the family in their home. And it increasingly became more difficult as the Israeli police, after 1949, the Israeli police, the Israeli army came into the house searching for weapons. They would interrogate her. They would ask her about a fiance whom they thought may be a fighter. And there were constant searches in their homes. The difficulty with her father was that his business, which was kind of a steel construction, a steel materials shop, it was located south of the old city in no man's land. And Issam Nassar wrote about this because my grandfather, Jirius, left a diary of his conflict with the new Israeli state, because he tried to retrieve the material, the goods from his shop after 1949, which was located in parts of West Jerusalem. And he hired an Israeli lawyer. They won the case, and the goods were worth about 100,000 pounds. He won the case, but then the Israeli state didn't permit him to retrieve his material. And they tried to kind of establish a life. They really had no income, I think, at one point, or it was very limited. And my mother and her sister ended up for a year living in a German convent in Jerusalem because of the constant searches in their home. They were able to endure all this for about 5 years. And in 1953, they came to the conclusion that it was too difficult living under this really house arrest and military rule, that they ended up moving to Ramallah. But all those memories, or the images I have of Jerusalem, really profoundly come from my mother and her life and her youth. And she really used to speak about it in such a romantic way, and not overly idealized in a way that we could critique it as historians. And it was a privileged life, I think, because she had this kind of, she came from a bourgeois family in a way, and had some wealth and had access to education. But so I think she was representative of that community that found that part of the larger community were Palestinians who were Jewish, Muslim, Christian, that it was just natural to go to school with them, to do business with them, to see them on the streets, to be their neighbors. So long answer maybe, I'm sorry, but that's my encounter and connection with Jerusalem other than being born there?
It's not long, actually. I would say it's
Okay.
not long enough, because in fact, one thing that I believe in, maybe you as an historian, you can tell me that one thing that is missing, and one thing that I noticed while actually recording episodes for the podcast, is the family history of Jerusalem. We know a lot about some of the families because of their role, particularly political or religious. We certainly have people, also guests on the podcast, like Mona Halabi, who collected and is still collecting thousands of pictures, not just of buildings, monuments, but also families. But we don't really have narratives of family themselves and how they experienced not just the tragic moments of 1948 and later on 1967, but also daily life, who they were, how they lived, which I believe is not just an issue probably with Jerusalem, is more, at large with Middle Eastern history. We probably still need to get there. But I was wondering if you feel like maybe we are missing a family history of Jerusalem.
Absolutely. It's that larger problem in the historiography, which a number of historians now have tackled. And I believe Bishara Domani wrote an article about his grandmother, emphasizing the importance of studying family histories and moving away from just this emphasis on the looking at the Palestinians solely through the lens of one of conflict or political conflict, and then political leaders and nationalist leaders, and seeing the diversities of the community and the diversity of the people who lived there as they made a life that may not always conform to this political context, or can only be understood and explained through a political context. A very mundane point would be my grandmother, Dellele, my mother's mother. She helped my grandfather set up his this steel business, this construction business after World War I, where she would help him in the shop, in the almost like a blacksmith shop, where she would help in I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, the bellows to make the fire hot enough to forge the steel, or because he was preparing steel for the construction, for sometimes just for the steel for veranda or for that you see. So she was part of that, but that story's never recorded, and that's only through hearsay from cousins I would get that information. And she was a wonderful person. And but that type of narrative of women being involved in those kind of businesses or industry, and she was involved in a very in a limited capacity. But there's so much we learn moving beyond just an understanding of history through the filter of what political leaders said, political leaders did, and seeing far more contestation, where on a popular level, the voices of fallahin, peasants, are only important if they contribute to a nationalist narrative, and if they are seen as complicating or muddling these nationalist narratives if they contradict it or challenge it. So absolutely, family histories, the historians who have done work on family histories, that's why Issam and Salim Tamari's work have been so important, retrieving those memoirs, and when you see it, it's the result of it is always very rich.
One thing I learned in my few years that I spent in Ireland is essentially the relevance of this kind of history, not just connected to dramatic events. Like in Ireland, they had obviously history of divisions and civil war and war of independence, but really, and obviously going back also to the famine, so these very dramatic events, but really it matters because it's about protecting heritage, their heritage as families, particularly in a context when you see people moving all around the world. In a sense, the Irish and the Palestinians, in different ways, they share some sort of a same sort of trajectory, as there are more Irish abroad than in Ireland, in fact. And and when you look at the number of Palestinian refugees and in time how they grew, again, you have these very large communities all abroad, and everything then becomes in a question of memory, heritage, and family history.
I'm sorry, just gonna, if you don't mind, we lose the material culture. My mother always used to bemoan when we would watch the PBS show, Antiques Roadshow, and she would say, all the things we left behind, and all the things everyone left behind in 48. All these, embroidery and material culture and art left behind or sadly looted. That's part of your heritage. That's part of how you tell family history. And you don't have access to that now. And you're absolutely right, because you're so migratory, you can't take that with you. And the Irish are an example of that.
Yeah, that was a fascinating comparison, which I kind of was aware of, but up until I started working in Ireland and getting in touch with, colleagues, friends, but also reading more about it, then I realized this kind of like strong connection between the two. And of course, it's not only between the Irish and Palestinians, but plenty of other communities. But certainly for me, as a personal experience, that brought them together. But let me now move to talk about the main subject of your professional career, which is the Nabi Musa Festival. And I guess the first question I want to ask you is, what is Nabi Musa? What is Nabi Musa Festival? Can you give us a sense of its origin?
Sure. First, let me say, I as much as I appreciate you referring to me as a world expert on Nabi Musa, I still feel like I'm, I'm learning a lot about it still. Nabi Musa refers to the prophet Moses, the most mentioned human in the Quran, and the most mentioned figure in the Quran other than God, and revered in the Islamic tradition. And in the Islamic tradition, there are stories, just as they derive from the Hebrew Bible, of certainly many stories of his career as a prophet, as a holy figure, and that are based in the Quran and the Bible, and popular literature that circulated widely in the Islamic world, as well as the Hadith, the oral traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. But there are also accounts of his death. And that is where in the Bible it says that he dies before entering the promised land, or the Holy Land. And there's always speculation of where he is buried. And in the Islamic tradition, there were a number of sites that claim to be his tomb. Some in Damascus, or south of Damascus, or east of the Jordan River near what is today Erbil. And travelers, religious scholars would debate this throughout the centuries, but other religious scholars and chroniclers would say in the medieval period that we don't know the location of Moses's tomb, and that he died in the desert without anyone knowing, and they fully accepted the Hebrew biblical account of it. But there was one local tradition that emerged in an era of during the Baibars, the Sultan Baibars of the Mamluk period in the 13th century. This is an era when the Mamluks are still in conflict with the Crusaders, and had just ended that conflict with them. So in many ways, the Holy Lands became themselves, these lands became contested, fought over, and so religious sites and holy sites became a way to assert one's claim to the land, one's legitimate claim to the land. And so certainly the Crusaders did this by marking, in a way, demarcating what the Holy Land is by building religious sites or monasteries, or saying that this shrine here is dedicated to this saint, in a way demarcating what the Holy Land is, a way of mapping their claims to the Holy Land. And so in this context of greater conflict over the land that is interpreted solely as a holy land, and that you can strengthen your claim to the land by asserting, by pointing to a religious shrine that is of your religious tradition. This is a period when we see an increasing number of Islamic religious sites dedicated to biblical figures. And as one scholar says, rediscovering these holy sites. And so you see a number of shrines dedicated to biblical figures, or Quranic figures, or shrines dedicated to those who fought against the Crusades. And so these shrines and holy places become markers to assert the claims of each religious community. And in a way, the Nabi Musa shrine near Jericho, south of Jerusalem, west of Jericho, becomes part of this larger, in a way, we could almost refer to it as a religious dialogue, a religious debate. And Baibars hears about the local tradition that honors a mound of earth, or a sand dune, or a dune, or a sand hill that local tradition had identified as the tomb of the Nabi Musa, the prophet Moses. And that claim had already been made about 50 years earlier or so by a Persian traveler, Al-Harawi. And but local tradition had identified it as Al-Kathib al-Ahmar, the red hill, or the red sand dune, or the red hill. And Al-Kathib al-Ahmar relates to a tradition in the Hadith, in which the Prophet Moses, which the Prophet Muhammad is said to have seen the Prophet Moses standing and praying in his tomb near Al-Kathib al-Ahmar, the red hill, that during his night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem. And so local tradition in Palestine identified Al-Kathib al-Ahmar near Jericho as, oh, this is the Kathib al-Ahmar This is the red hill mentioned in the oral tradition, the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. And so because of that, in a way of strengthening Viber's claim to be this defender of Islam, this warrior in jihad against the Crusaders par excellence, he established a waqf, an endowment, to support a maqam, a shrine, and a tomb to be built, a shrine to be built over the tomb, and really constructing more of a tomb at this site. And so he, in the year 1269, really gives legitimacy to this claim, though at the time there were probably competing claims and about 4 or 5 other claims. But because of his support for it financially, he establishes this endowment, which also allows for welcoming pilgrims once a year for an annual festival, and lands to support the feeding of the pilgrims in the shrine and for the shrine's upkeep. But it's a very humble shrine. It's really only 5 meters by 5 meters. And it's built in the typical style of a dome over a tomb. So it's not this larger structure that some of your listeners may be familiar with today, with large walls and cells that accommodate visitors. It's a very humble shrine in a remote, largely desolate area without any vegetation or water available, though there's a small well that is near the shrine, becomes part of the courtyard of the shrine, but it's a very remote area. And so it's not an imposing architectural structure in the way other large shrines are. It's a very humble structure. Over time, this became one of the leading and most important festivals for the Muslims of southern Palestine. And it was while maybe today some people will be familiar with the images of the gathering of pilgrims coming to Jerusalem, many surrounded with sacred banners, town and village banners, as well as scouts. That and really a representation almost of a nationalist festival. That is very recent, only in the 19th century. For most of its history, from the 13th century into the 19th century, it is largely a site of pilgrimage once a year in April, largely conforming to the Orthodox Easter calendar, where the festival would begin for a week before Good Friday in the Orthodox Easter calendar. And there are many Muslim religious celebrations that conform to the Orthodox Easter calendar and religious calendars. And but most of the for many centuries up to the 19th century, most of the celebrations were at the shrine, where pilgrims would come from Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, and they would perform ziyarah, a pilgrimage, to gain proximity to the sacredness, the barakah of the tomb. And they would light votive candles. They would conduct Sufi rituals, such as dhikr ceremonies, reciting the name of God. They would also dance in a folkloric way or folk dances and sing folk songs. Um, but the shrine itself was the site of the festival. And it had no association really with Jerusalem as the site. The pilgrimage was the main purpose, to worship at the shrine. And this is where we see there's really little difference than what we may assume, because sometimes it's referred to as popular religious culture or popular religion. It's hard to assign that kind of nomenclature to it because, or terminology, because you have ulama, religious officials from Jerusalem, Ottoman officials, certainly peasants from and villagers from Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, Bedouin, all come together to worship there. There isn't a clear demarcation between what is official Islam from so-called popular Islam. And that doesn't itself appear as a category until the modern era. So it is largely a site of religious worship at the shrine until the mid-19th century, when in the mid-19th century, in an era of modern reforms, state reforms, greater state authority over the territory, over the provinces, and the formation of new state institutions such as municipalities and the provincial councils, this is when these new authorities, in a way, appropriate control of the festival and redesign it in a way to, I argue, augment their own authority. The Ottoman authorities are interested in Jerusalem because they want to make sure that they still appear to the larger public as honorable Muslims respecting Islamic tradition in an era of modern Western secular reforms. And the local notables want to appear as they redesigned the festival in a way, locating it more in Jerusalem, where where villagers and towns from Hebron and Nablus and their surrounding villages would first meet in Jerusalem on certain designated days, worship at the Haram al-Sharif, and then march out with their colorful banners representing their towns, Sufi orders, villages, to just outside the city at Ras al-Abud, on the road towards Jericho, where the municipality of Jerusalem had set up a tent to welcome them, offer them refreshments. In a way, then unofficially they could just march on their own to the shrine. And but having them all congregate there was a way not just to, in a way, it asserted Jerusalem's municipal authority. It asserted the authority of these new municipal and provincial figures in the Sanjak, the province of Jerusalem, that now had greater state control, who exercised greater political power, as well as exercised military and political power and authority through the entire Sanjak. That the days of local rural notables had ended, and that the urban notables were the true authority. So in a way, it is it is a ritual to assert the authority and the status and prestige of these urban notables over rural leaders, and telling the rural people, make sure you know we can tax you, we can conscript you, we can create a census. And it's not really, though some have interpreted as forging a nationalist identity. In that way of people congregating, yes, they share a sense of community, but in so many ways, the new modern festival was there to assert the authority of urban notables over rural people, and it maintained their rural identities. People entered carrying the banners of their villages, of their towns, of their local Sufi orders. They had to concede in rituals where they visited or watched local officials now leading ceremonies when previously they had nothing to do with the festival. And so this becomes now the new modern festival in the mid-19th century. And then I can talk about, if you want, the Mandate era, or if you have another question.
Well, you answered already a kind of a list of questions I had about the festival, so I really enjoyed it because you preempted a lot of stuff that I wrote down. I was just curious about a couple of things here. First of all, about the rituals. Were these rituals kind of like organized in some way, or did they emerge spontaneously? So what do we know about sort of the transformation of these rituals, and to what extent politics played a role in the transformation also of the Nabi Musa festival?
Excellent question. And I'm glad you centered on organized. Were these rituals organized? For most of its history, pilgrims went to the shrine. They were largely accompanied by the Ottoman military, because it's a desolate, remote area that was always subject to brigands and attacks from Bedouins. So they had to be accompanied. But other than that, what I've read is that there's very little oversight from religious officials, or even kind of to correct myself, the members of the ulama themselves participated in these rituals. So it's not as if the members of the Jerusalem ulama perform their own rituals always separate from the larger religious ceremonies that were going on. Our impression is the ulama represent just official Islam, and they're completely divorced from the larger rural traditions. But there are many accounts I point to of members of the ulama in Jerusalem welcoming Sufis to Jerusalem, accompanying them to the shrine, where the Sufis would play their drums, cymbals, sing, dance. In one instance, this is, I can't remember exactly who, one religious official, one member of the ulama tells a Sufi visiting from Egypt, these activities that you see, the Sufis dancing, playing drums, they all conform to permissible legal actions. And so they are acceptable in the legal category in the Sharia. And so don't think that they're haram. Certainly mystics themselves were part of a larger community of what scholars refer to as scholar Sufis. They had a foothold in the world of the Sharia and the scholarship and mysticism. And so they would not have seen these religious activities as something to kind of control or to monitor. They themselves participated in them And one of the most prominent was the 18th century Sufi scholar and Nabi who traveled widely and wrote about his time visiting the shrine and then circulating the same popular stories everyone circulated at the time. Stories of the prophet Moses appearing, stories of miracles happening, stories of apparitions. And so this was, they were part of that larger community. It's not this organized religion in constant conflict with local traditions. That's something more familiar in the modern era, where religious officials want, usually attached to a state structure, want to impose those kind of traditions. Sufis were very prominent. They played their drums, they played cymbals, they sang, they formed large circles of men rhythmically dancing to the enunciation of the word Allah or God or other religious words. And so these were part of the larger traditions, lighting candles, worshiping at the tomb. And so they were conducted largely together. In the modern era, this is when religious officials become part of new ceremonies in Jerusalem, not at the shrine, where they are ceremoniously receiving the sacred banners, sacred banner of Jerusalem, of the Nabi Musa that the Husseini family preserved, or of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or of Nabi Dawood, the prophet David. They would be ceremoniously received, ceremoniously folded in elaborate ceremonies alongside maybe the governor of Jerusalem. The mayor would participate, certain notables of Jerusalem, but they didn't transfer their religious ceremonies to the shrine. They had still, they maintained a minimal presence at the shrine officially. And all the quote unquote official ceremonies, or what I refer to as the modern official Nabi Musa festival, happened in Jerusalem. It didn't occur at the shrine, where local officials, Jerusalem notables, religious authorities participated alongside one another in what were seen as religious ceremonies, ceremoniously folding and unfolding the banners, presenting them to the banner bearers, leading prayers. But this also included now new secular authorities like Ottoman officials and local notables.
And so I really want to move to the more, it's not even contemporary, but certainly the 20th century period, because with the arrival of the British, the Nabi Musa festival changed. And it's not only because of the arrival of the British, but it's also because of the, obviously, the arrival of Zionists from Europe, which changed the demographic picture of Palestine and partly of Jerusalem, but also the politics, obviously, of the city itself. And by 1920, Nabi Musa festival became also very political. And as we know, in 1920, the Nabi Musa festival was transformed into a series of riots, which I personally argue was like some sort of a test between the two movements, and he used the festival in order to test each other's strength. And obviously the interpretation of that riot can be very different. I was just wondering, how did the Nabi Musa festival change throughout the British mandate, and how and why the British eventually, essentially, kind of like ended this, tradition?
Well, I can say first publicly, thank you for your wonderful work on the 1920 violence and Nabi Musa, and I learned a lot from it. And absolutely, it becomes a site notorious for violence in 1920, referred to as the 1920 riots in Jerusalem. or 1920 Nabi Musa riots. But throughout most of the mandate period, it remained largely nonviolent, largely peaceful, but where most of the violence was intracommunal. But what's interesting is I found once the British arrived, the first Nabi Musa festival is held in April 1918. And so this is only 4 or 5 months after the British arrived. And they are immediately interested in it. There's a British military officer, I think he had the rank of a general, who wrote a report about it. And he is framing it in 1918 as this has the potential to bring all the communities together. And where we can participate and be associated with it to display our respect for the Arab and Muslim people of Palestine. So he gets it in the way that the British are involved in festivals in India, in various colonies. They either appropriate native traditions and cultures, or they introduce their own and invite local natives to be a part of them. And so the British quickly assign a role for themselves. They, in a way, they like to appear as allowing Ottoman traditions, Islamic traditions to continue in an era of British rule. So they basically supplement the role that the Ottomans performed. They replace the Ottoman military with their military band leading the processions. They, Ronald Storrs takes the place of the Ottoman governor in receiving and the banners, the sacred banners. The British officials attend a number of different ceremonies associated with the festival. So they like to quickly, they put themselves in the place that the Ottomans had once performed in. And that they assumed these roles that the British that the Ottomans had once assumed. And so the British are very disturbed by the 1920 riots because they see them as disrupting the image of communal harmony that they hoped the Nabi Musa festival and that British rule could engender and could foster. And they continue to, after 1920, to monitor the festival. They monitor it closely, as one of your previous guests had referred to it, as they fetishized the banners. Oh, I'm embarrassingly, Yair Wallach had referred to it as that way, that they talked about the arrival of the banners, not the arrival of pilgrims. So they always monitored it to as a security concern, but they had a close agreement with the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, other notables, that if they wanted to maintain their role as interlocutors, as unofficial representatives of the Arab population, they had to make sure that violence would not erupt. But the British, and not just the British civilians, European civilians, even European monarchy attended, and in one instance, the Belgian prince and princess, who would later become the future king and queen of Belgium, they marched in the processions as if they were one of the pilgrims, as a writer for an Arabic newspaper said. So their presence was ubiquitous And so it really belies the impression of it as always a nationalist, anti-British festival. If the British were always there, they certainly didn't stir a nationalist, anti-British violent response. I'll just say quickly, most of the violence after 1920 were intracommunal between Muslims, largely in conflicts over maybe between a village and a Bedouin tribe over land, or between supporters of the Husseinis or the supporters of the Nashashibis. But it wasn't violence directed. It wasn't always a festival that was organized as creating mass politics and mass mobilization against the British. Actually, many of the notables, many of the political leaders are always calling for a peaceful celebration. By the way, much of the violence in Christian festivals, such as Easter time, were always between different Christian denominations, between maybe Egyptian Copts and Orthodox, or who are attending the same ceremony at the same time. The British were very ubiquitous in their presence in the festival, and they were quite confident, even though they monitored it, that it would remain a peaceful festival.
It certainly is true that most of the violence was between the various sects, and we have plenty of records of that. And it seems like this was largely forgotten for a long time, even though obviously there was some sort of narrative suggesting that, well, all the communities came together, which they did, in particularly under the British. But it's also true that this sort of skirmishes between particularly various denominations always occurred. And again, I think it's true for not just the Nabi Musa festival, but for all sorts of festivals and kind of gatherings where it becomes a chance for groups to settle scores, or perhaps, to take advantage of, that gathering in order to express themselves in a different way. But I don't certainly want to go there, but I'm very interested in how eventually Nabi Musa ended and how people reacted to the end of this old festival. And also, if you can give us a sense of its sort of idea of coming back, because somehow we saw Nabi Musa festival coming back.
Right. Let me say that by the late 20s, early 30s, this is when you get to begin to see the larger crowds and the images of large processions coming into the city. This is when the Mufti invites pilgrims from areas that had not traditionally celebrated Nabi Musa. So coming from Jaffa, coming from Jaffa, Haifa, inviting youth and scouting groups, and placing the scouts, who kind of represented a muscular Islam, a vibrant community, who chanted anti-colonial, anti-Zionist slogans, but which the elite never really associated with, but they were given free rein to exercise that. So the image most people may see in pictures of the large crowds come largely from the late 20s, early 30s, up to the time Haj Amin is forced to leave or escapes after 1937. And by that time, it has more of this nationalist image and as nationalist festival. And so there is a clear difference in many of the observers after Haj Amin leaves the country in a time of the Great Revolt. The British are trying to suppress this. There's different pockets of resistance throughout the country. And so by in this era, when it is when the security of the country is in question, in British eyes, they take advantage of it first after in 1938. It's canceled, and the British say next year, we'll allow it if when people have more money to spend on Nabi Musa. And it's almost a tacit agreement with the organizers. By 1939, though, the British have militarily suppressed the revolt enough that they are fully confident in how they govern the country. And they are confident enough to say that they're going to reorganize the festival symbolically in a way as radically as it was reorganized in the mid-19th century, where they now impose new demands that pilgrims aren't going to come from Hebron and Nablus and carry banners and carry the Arab flag and carry banners denouncing the British and chant denouncing the Zionists and the British. Now, all the ceremonies are going to be restricted to the Haram al-Sharif, where the only banners that would be permitted to be raised are in the Haram al-Sharif, and only a select group of religious officials and notables alongside the British colonial officials would be able to ceremoniously retrieve them, fold them, raise them, and then there'd be no other ceremonies outside of the Haram, such as the Ras al-Amud municipal tent. And that pilgrims would just go on their own without the accompaniment of a musical band or scouts or large procession of pilgrims to the shrine themselves. So they largely truncated the festival, which would sometimes take half a day, such as the retrieval of the Nabi Musa banner from the home of the Husseini home in the old city would take a couple hours or more. To travel that short distance would now take, it wouldn't even be held. Or the pilgrims coming from, the pilgrims that came from Hebron would sometimes spend the night at the railway station or assemble at the Solomon's pools before entering the old city. They now truncated and eliminated that ceremonial entrance. So what would take hours or half the day to complete would now, the raising of the banners would take 15 minutes. And as the British boasted, this was an orderly festival without any chance, without any hostility against us. And so to them, it was a success. And they perceived it as a failure for the Palestinian nationalist leaders, because they interpreted the festival only through their colonial gaze, as that it has to be something directed against us. So it's now failed as a festival because it's not a political demonstration, even though to most peasants or rural people, villagers who still worshipped at the shrine, to them the festival could still be held at the shrine. So it wasn't measured as a success or failure in that way. But to observers, even to many Palestinian observers in the press, they certainly noticed a distinction after 1937, after 1938, that it is less passionate, that it is not as a vibrant festival, that it is a very muted celebration. And would you like me to speak about its revival?
Yes, please. I'm very curious about it.
Okay, well, after 48, both the Israelis and the first the Jordanians allow the festival, they hesitate to allow it, and they permit it for a few more years, if my memory is correct, up to 1951 or 53 is really the last festival. I'm sorry, maybe 51. And they're very restrictive in allowing any visitors to the shrine outside of designated times. And so the Jordanian monarchy, after especially King Hussein ascends on the throne, sees it as just as competition of associating an Islamic site and an Islamic festival with Palestinian nationalist aspirations. So that's why they restricted. The Israelis fully restricted. After 67, they designate the area around the shrine as a military zone. And so it's very difficult to go there. They do allow it one time before the Intifada in 1987 to be revived. And that was the last time. Then under the PA in 94, they assume control of the festival. And in 95, it becomes fully under the Palestinian Authority, which revives this kind of image, tries to revive the image of that Palestinians had of a memory of the festival as a nationalist celebration. The shrine is festooned with the colors of the Palestinian flag, images of Yasser Arafat, and there are nationalist slogans that the official festival leaders will say in speeches. But even then, many Sufis who are associated, who visit, rural people or people throughout the Palestine region, continue to worship in a more quote unquote traditional way of wanting to worship, to venerate the shrine as a source of barakah, of blessings. And this happens into the 2000s when there are more official ceremonies that the PA hosts, speeches, dances, speakers that are giving speeches. They have to compete with the Sufis who on their own just want to dance in a mystical way or perform dhikr ceremonies. And so there's that constant competition that has been prevalent since the modern era, the modern festival. And in the 2000s, at one point, remarkably, the shrine became a site unofficially for drug rehabilitation. And what was described to me as religious extremists took men off the street who were drug addicts to the shrine as a site to rehabilitate them, but it was not done in a proper medical way or a medical treatment center. But later, by the mid 2000s and a little later, it became a site of a proper rehabilitation center led by those trained in rehabilitation. What's also interesting, and I'm not sure their connection to Sufism, but when I visited in 2014, many of the men who were there for rehabilitation participated in the unofficial Sufi ceremonies at the shrine. So I don't know fully the connection between their rehabilitation and mysticism. And just a final word, by around 2010, a new ritual actor appears, Turkey. Turkey begins to fund renovations of the shrine, as Turkey as a state supports many Palestinian charitable causes, renovations. They highlight the shrine as a site of Ottoman history, while many Palestinians remember it as associated with Palestinian nationalism of the Mandate period. And my own observation when I went, many of the organizers of the shrine almost fawned over the arrival of the Turkish ambassador and Turkish officials, because they certainly provide a lot of support to the shrine. So once it's continued to change. It's not fixed in time. It's part of the larger historical dynamics.
We discussed with Louis Fishman briefly in the episode I recorded with him the ubiquitous presence of Erdogan in the not just the politics of Palestine, but also literally in daily life of Jerusalem, as I personally had the experience often to get a coffee in a bookstore in East Jerusalem, and more I start hearing people speaking Turkish, and that sort of ubiquitous presence also translates with the arrival of many Turks that are settling down for a period of times in Jerusalem. They're literally changing the makeup of a city. So it's a fascinating dynamic that has been taking place in the past 10 years or so. I have one.
There's Janissary bands, and the Sufis from the Jamaluddin order will perform there as well. So an honorary Janissary band that comes every year. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So the Ottoman legacy is still there, indeed.
Yes, they like to highlight it. Yeah, absolutely.
I have one more question, and it goes back to the very beginning when we were just briefly discussing the podcast, which I literally designed with the purpose to sort of make the history of Jerusalem more available, and at the same time to keep the history of Jerusalem within the boundaries of academic research. So in a sense, it's a project of public history, where while interviewing scholars, but also other individuals connected to the history of Jerusalem, to use a different language and to somehow make the history of Jerusalem more palatable, more understandable, and to move away from just the black and white, but to tell the audience and the listener that there are so many complexities and so many layers, and yet these are available, and they may help us to have a better understanding of contemporary Jerusalem. And I was wondering, from your point of view as a historian, but also as a listener of a podcast, is there anything that you think should be discussed, anything that is missing out there in forms of public history of Jerusalem that should be discussed more? So to provide better tools for people, Muslim, Jews, Christians, people with an interest in the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict and cause, to get a better understanding and to have to form their opinions, not just based on short reports from the media, which sometimes they forget a lot of these complexities.
Yeah, wonderful question. I think it's our responsibility as historians, as if I could say scholars of this area, to identify how radically the social setting in Jerusalem has changed in the last 3 to 4 decades, never mind going back to 67, just since the 1980s even. And even we could absolutely go back to 48, but even just in the last few decades, of how radical the changes have been in the city under Israeli rule, where only a few years ago, like the memories of my mother, their experience with Jerusalem was a city far more fluid in its communal interactions, its interactions between people of different classes, people of different religions, ethnicities. I know you had a great podcast regarding a scholar of Armenians in Jerusalem. And that history was severed after 48. It was further undermined after 67 with Israeli policies that, in the words of Teddy Kollek, intend to Judaize the city. That history, what we're seeing in the last few decades, defies a historical setting that had evolved over centuries, if not millennia, and that we now, so many people on a popular level associate Jerusalem as, well, it's the capital of Israel. It's a Jewish city, but it's a city that had a far richer history of communal interactions, of different communities, of tolerance. I don't want to exaggerate and overly romanticize the interactions between different religious communities, primarily Muslim, Jewish, and Christian in Jerusalem. But I think it's hard to defy when one of your former guests, Mordecai Klein, spoke about it, the far more fluid interactions between the communities. And as Michelle Campos certainly has written about this in her wonderful book, Ottoman Brothers. And a future guest you will have, I know, Abigail Jacobson, that it's far more complex and far more fluid. But our interpretation of it today is it's just a Jewish city. And one of the almost touching episodes or vignettes that I found when doing my research is seeing that the Europeans, the Ottomans in the mid-19th century considered the Europeans as an audience of the festival. They wanted to declare to European consuls and representatives in the city that this is an Ottoman Islamic city, even though we know you covet it as a Christian city. And one of the other audience were Palestinian villagers who, local notables said to them, we're the authority, not your local rural notables. But a third audience were the Christian and Jewish residents of Jerusalem, like Wasif Jawhariya, who regularly attended and enjoyed watching it and participated in it. And that history, that knowledge of that is something that I always enjoy reading about. It is certainly not always we don't always have to interpret in the most romantic way, but it's hard to defy that reality. And I think it's as much as we can to retrieve that knowledge, to retrieve that memory, is something your podcast is doing. Other scholars are doing a wonderful work on as well. So I'm hoping that's what you and I and others can continue to do.
This was Awad Alaby, currently associate professor at Wright State University and author of the upcoming book, Palestinian Rituals of Identity, the Prophet Moses Festival in Jerusalem, 1850-1948, that will be published by the University of Texas Press, hopefully in the coming months. Awad, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. It's been a great pleasure, and I really enjoy your podcast. Thank you for doing all the hard work for organizing this. I find it so invaluable.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.